This is SoundNotion, the weekly podcast for new music and music news. I'm Dave McDonald.
I'm Nate Blyton.
I'm Sam Merciers.
And joining us again this week is our good friend Drew McManus from Adaptistration, the great blog about the orchestra business. He's an orchestra business consultant and knows everything there is to know about the orchestra world. Is that right, Drew?
If you say so, thanks.
Well, thank you for joining us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So our first story this week is probably the biggest controversy of the week, and that is the new release by Steve Reich. It will come out in September, and the album art was unveiled this week, first at Sequenza 21, and then at Nonesuch, the record label's website, and has since been picked up on Slate and a number of other websites, including NPR's Great Deceptive Cadence blog, and it has engendered quite a bit of controversy. If you're in the video feed of our podcast, I'm going to put that up. If you're not, I guess to describe it, it's a photo that I think we all, at least in the U.S., remember very clearly from September 11th. The album, I think I forgot to mention, is the premiere recording of Steve Reich's WTC 911, which is a piece for string quartet, or actually 3 string quartets, but usually, like a lot of that work, 2 of them are recorded, and recorded sounds that are taken from some phone calls that were made on 9/11 and some interviews with people after 9/11 about that day. And the photograph that's on the album cover is the airplane headed for the second tower. You see both World Trade Center towers. The first one is on fire, and the second one is about to be hit. This is right before the airplane hits the second tower. It's a pretty powerful photograph. It's been photoshopped a little bit to look a little more grimy, and it just says in very clear Gothic script at the top Steve Reich, and at the bottom WTC 911 Kronos Quartet. So a lot of people have found that this album cover is offensive and over the top, and I don't know. What do you think, Sam? Were you offended by this album cover?
No. I mean, it's not like we haven't seen this image thousands of times. You know, they're putting something out there that they think is going to sell albums, and I think it's going to probably pique a lot more interest than it's going to detract people from wanting to buy the album. So congratulations to them. Mission accomplished, I think. The idea that the fact that it's been altered is put forth as something that some people will have trouble with, and I find that completely ridiculous too, because every photo you look at of anything has been altered. You know, there is, in photographic representation, there is no reality versus unreality. It's all unreality because it's taken from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions, etc., etc., etc. So
go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that's part of being a photographer in 2011 is knowing how to use tools to manipulate the photograph digitally in some way. You know,
well,
part of a photographer's toolkit, as it were, is not just the camera and the lenses. It's also, you know, Photoshop or Lightroom or Aperture or whatever it is people use for their photographs. That's, you know, part of the game. And
that's really no different than it's always been, you know. Ansel Adams took pictures that were inspiring in that they're of these majestic sweeping views, but the depth and the power of the photograph only comes through when he does his work in the darkroom and comes up with the image. It's no different, you know. He's not giving you an accurate representation of exactly what was there. He's making something out of the raw material he shot while he was there.
And, of course, Deceptive Cadence has on their blog posted not only the album cover, but they have the original photo as well. I'm going to put that up as well on the video. You can see clearly the sky is bright blue in the actual photo, and it's kind of a gray, brownish color in the album cover. What do you guys think, Nate, Drew? Nate, go ahead.
Well, so the original photo, there's this contrast of like this was a normal day. It was blue skies and like just everything was going, and then there's the smoke and the plane crashing into the building. With the altered photo, it looks like it's a war zone, and like this is all this, like there's this contrast in the original photo that was part of that day of like, this is, I mean, how could this happen, and all all this stuff. And with the cover, it's more of a commentary about like what it meant, kind of in hindsight, of like that this is it's a war and everything. To me, I don't know.
Yeah, I can see that. Drew, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, a few. This is the first I've actually seen or heard of this. I haven't come across it to date, and I haven't heard the CD, so I don't know what the music is like. But
yeah,
I think ultimately, in the end, does it really matter? Because classical music lasts hundreds of years to begin with. 50 years from now, is it going to have any sort of impact with the visual image as opposed to the actual music in the recording or not? Otherwise, it just seems to be something to talk about now, just to garner interest, or people want to express a feeling about an event that's still fresh enough on everyone's memory that it's going to pull out that sort of emotional response.
Mm-hmm. And go ahead, Sam.
Well, like putting controversial artwork on CDs or albums or whatever is nothing new. They've been doing it for years to try and sell albums. Actually, if you type in controversial album covers or controversial album artwork into Google, there's lots and lots of hits. And some I'd already thought of, like Amorica by the Black Crowes was banned. All kinds of really tame things if you look back through history. But, you know, I don't see why None Such should be any different than Arista or whoever put out Sticky Fingers by the Rolling Stones. They're trying to sell albums.
Absolutely.
We're not trying to, I mean, people can pretend it's something else, but it's just a piece of music. It's not going to mean anything to the people that we lost that day. As far as Drew's point about whether or not it's going to mean anything, I think it will. It'll mean something completely different 50 years from now when people look at it, if they're from the United States and they even remember what this is referencing. But it's a pretty iconic image.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Well, I mean, first, let me say that none of us have heard this piece, I don't think. This is its premiere recording, so unless we've heard it live, we haven't heard it. Also, personally, and I apologize if anyone finds this offensive, I do not feel this visceral, close emotional connection to 9/11 the way a lot of other Americans do, particularly Americans that live in or near New York City or deal with people in New York City a lot. So I did not lose anybody, and I don't think anybody I know did either. So that it may just be that I am not as close to this as other people are. Maybe that would offend me if I were somebody else, but I'm not, and it doesn't. One of the things that has been brought up a few times is that, notably by Seth Coulter-Walls over at Slate, is that the piece itself is not this emotional, transcendent kind of piece the way John Adams on the Transmigration of Souls is sort of this 21st century requiem. It's much more literal. It's very similar in my head to Different Trains. Obviously, the medium is very similar. If you're familiar with that, Steve Reich worked for string quartet and recorded sounds, and he says that this kind of emotional, aggressive album art is offensive to him only in that it doesn't have anything to do with the music, and I think that's a fair fair criticism, though again it's not so much an emotional reaction to it as much as an intellectual reaction that this isn't a very good way to advertise this music. And composer Timo Andres on his blog, a pianist, I guess. He's also a composer, but I think he's more well known as a pianist, has made an alternate version of this. If you don't want that cover in your iTunes album art, he has basically remade the cover so that it's exactly the same as the cover originally released, but does not have a photograph. So it's just black, and it has the same type everywhere else. It says Steve Reich, WTC 911 Kronos Quartet.
Has anybody heard of the White Album by the Beatles? If you want to find some music about 9/11 to be offended about, how about some of the country music people that are, using one image on the cover of an album doesn't bother me. It's the cadre of, what's his name? Daryl Worley, Have You Forgotten? Yeah. I'd much rather have somebody use one image and see what impact that has on the audience rather than a whole song of sappy crap trying to, leech money out of the emotions of the American public.
Yeah, and that's I think one of the things that people say about this piece is that this piece is not that kind of jingoistic, nationalistic kind of experience. It's just about people. Which I think is an interesting take, and the album art doesn't reflect that.
I really look forward to hearing this piece, because I much prefer that conversation of talking about the music and what it has to do with the content, and then the relationship between that and the cover, as opposed to just talking about the cover on its own context.
Well, I can imagine that come September we'll have a lot to say about this. I believe the album is slated for September 7th?
6th, isn't it?
It's the closest Tuesday to the 10th anniversary of September 11th.
Yeah. I can't remember where I read it. There was one funny comment that said that it looks like a Rudy Giuliani campaign poster.
Yeah, and we should say that if you're interested in reading anything about this, be sure whenever you read the stuff on the web to check the comments, because there are as we've discussed, people that feel very, very strongly about it. But come September, there's going to be one place where you're probably not going to be able to find a copy of this recording, and that's going to be at Borders, which for many, many years has been one of the few places in the United States, anyway, where you
Proud
can walk
Michigan
into
company.
A proud Michigan company from Ann Arbor, Michigan, has so they're not going to be around much any longer. They've announced that they're closing their doors. And for a long time, they were one of the few places in the U.S. where you could walk into a store and look at a pretty solid selection of classical music on CD. Do you guys think this is going to have a significant impact on classical record sales?
No.
Why, Sam?
But what it'll keep, like in an average city, it'll keep the 14 people that actually go there to buy their albums that way from blind, and this is per year, to peruse the classical section. I mean, big deal. I mean, not that it's not a big deal for the people who are losing their jobs and all that kind of thing, but as far as it's in the context of classical music specifically, I think it's a non-starter. It doesn't mean anything. And in truth, it's better off. We're better off the sooner we as a public are willing to let go of the idea that music is something we need to go and pick up this artifact in order to get, the better off we're going to be, because it just makes things run more smoothly.
I think one thing that's really interesting about this, I'm sorry to keep going, if Nate or Drew, if you have anything to say, please interrupt us. But I think one thing that's interesting about this discussion, and this was only brought up again by the NPR Deceptive Cadence blog, is that we're worried about this happening, and the reason Borders is going down is that they did not jump on digital distribution the same way Amazon and Barnes & Noble did.
Yes.
Right? Barnes & Noble, I just read recently that the new Nook Color outsold the Kindle last month for the first time. Barnes & Noble and Amazon have jumped on digital distribution. Borders jumped on digital early, and they had a good website, and you could check the availability of a book in a store. So they had this really great tie-in between their website and their inventory system. But they did not jump on online ordering quite the same way that obviously Amazon and after Amazon, Barnes & Noble did. And they certainly have not jumped on to digital distribution, and by that I mean ebooks, the way these other companies did. And you know what? That's fine. We don't need hard copies of things like we used to. And what Sam was saying is that people are getting their music digitally now. So they were behind in both of these respects, and I think it's not going to be a huge loss to have that experience. Though at the same time, there are plenty of people who don't embrace these things. I know plenty of people who don't like to buy their music on the web for a number of reasons. One is that they don't have a handy hardware player to carry around with them. They don't have a way to play it in their car, or simply that they don't think that the music sold digitally is of a very high quality. You know, the recording is encoded in as an MP3 or a low bitrate M4A if you're on iTunes, and they want to record it a lot in a lossless format. We talked about lossless and lossy audio recordings about a month ago on the show. What do you think, Nate? Do you think we're going to lose something by losing this this venue for buying hard copies of classical music?
Well, me personally, I'm not going to lose anything by that venue. The thing I was thinking about is just that I go to the Barnes & Noble that's in town, that's over by where I work all the time, to just like go in, read something for a little bit, and look at what albums are there and stuff. And yeah, I think I really do like that physical browsing thing, and I haven't experienced that as much on the web, and that's one of the things that they mentioned in this article, is that the different digital distribution people haven't been able to capture that quite as well, of just like flipping through albums and getting that much information that easily about
that's a good point. What about discovery?
Yeah. And
well, I don't think that discovery is a compelling argument, because I opened up Amazon and typed in Brahms, and of course there's thousands of hits. And one of the points the article makes is, in the Deceptive Cadence article, is how hard it is to, there's a lot of metadata involved in classical music CDs.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking at a Brahms box set of symphonies, and not only can I preview, it tells me which orchestra with a link to the orchestra that recorded each of these. It's got all the all the liner notes. It's got user reviews. I can listen to a sample of each movement of every symphony, and it suggests other things that, based on their logarithms or whatever, might be things I would want to buy. Now, that may not be as romantic as going and shopping in a store, a brick and mortar store, but the people that really, really, really are into that and don't want it to go away are all going to be dead in 20 years, and it won't matter.
But I think along the lines of what Nate's saying, what if you don't know that you want Brahms?
Yeah.
If you don't know that that's what you're looking for, you're not going to find it that way. And what about the store clerk that you develop a relationship with and might be able to help you? I think there's something to say for this personal relationship that you develop with the people that are serving you in these brick and mortar stores.
How many of those brick and mortar stores actually had people that knew anything about classical music, though? Do you think?
I guarantee you that the guy that works at the Barnes & Noble that Nate's talking about does, because I've met him.
Okay. Well, and that is, I acknowledge that that's a sad thing to go, but it's going to go. And there are different ways to discover music online, So you're saying that the ways that you might discover music online are not as good as browsing through the things that store happens to order,
They're not as organic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's one of the real issues I think that's being discussed now, not just in this sense, but in the larger sense online, even with the algorithms that you mentioned, Sam, how those are being constructed, and depending on your point of view, they're either being manipulated or over-focused in a way that limits the bubble of interaction that people have online, so that what they may discover is more of what someone else wants them to discover, as opposed to what they may have simply tripped over on their own, which would be more of what I think Nate was describing with the brick and mortar in-person discovery process. Your eye just glances, you happen to see the CD that was in the front that might have an eye-catching photo like the one we just talked about. So you pick it up and take a look at it. It may or may not have been something you looked at. I don't think that experience exists nearly to the same degree online as it does in the brick or mortar store, But the other component I haven't seen numbers for, and I don't even know if they exist or not, is what kind of impact that had on a newbie, a casual, or a hardcore buyer.
Right. Well, you know, I wonder if the same thing could have been said when the recording industry was first getting cranked up. Did people feel the same way about, now that they have these records and record players and all these homes, we're never going to go see live music anymore? And it's, you know,
People
there was
did say
probably
that.
there was a lot of truth to that. There was a lot of truth to that. And, you know, society changes and culture changes. And this is one thing that's just going to keep going this way because it's a cheaper way to get it done. And, you know, while we're on that topic, the hippie inside me wants to say, you know, it's a lot better for the environment to have distributed content digitally where there's not a lot of packaging involved. Certainly I want these guys that actually know their business, like the boarders in town you're talking about, to have jobs. But, you know, if somebody like boarders can figure out a way to make the brick and mortar experience more engaging and worthwhile, maybe, but we'll see.
Yeah,
that's true, and I think it's interesting to discuss these things. Another problem I think with the discovery online is, and this is kind of related to what Drew was saying about how the algorithm affects the way you find things. Another thing the algorithm does, and this is something that has been discussed recently with regard to Google personalizing search, is that it kind of creates a bubble, and it makes you. It can make you less likely to find something outside of what you're already listening to. And that's, I think, one of the really great things about a record store is finding something that not only is new to you, but is part of a genre or a group of recordings that's completely new to you. And that's something that I think is definitely going to be much harder to set up in some digital discovery.
Right. Sure, but, you know, we have Pandora, and stuff like Pandora. It's not like the only way you're going to find or get suggestions about music is through Amazon or whoever. There's a whole world of people who have opinions about what music is good, and it's right there in front of me on my computer screen.
Right. And there are a lot of ways you can listen to music on the web.
Which means we need to be educating our children in college about how to empower themselves online, right? It's true.
You sound like a hippie liberal arts guy.
That's right.
Yeah. Teaching at some residential arts college or something like that.
I wish.
So, speaking of discovering music online, that's two.
Bang!
The first one was so smooth. I know. Impressed.
I had to draw attention to the second one, though. I couldn't help myself. One of the great ways that I have actually, over the last year or so, been discovering music online has been through streaming radio services that are, so this is not, we're not talking about Pandora where you set up a stream just for you. This is more like traditional radio where there's a person that sets up the thing and everybody that tunes in listens to the same feed. And one of the big ones right now in new music is Q2. Another one that we've talked about before is Counterstream Radio from the American Music Center, now New Music USA.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Is it .com?
Well, you can get to Counterstream Radio through counterstreamradio.org, I believe, and also through New Music Box, of course. But anyway, Q2, which is from WNYC and WQXR, the kind of sister public radio stations in New York City, Q2 is a web radio station that plays a lot of new music, and it's a great way to discover new pieces. And they currently have a listener survey that's open, and I don't know if we really need to spend a lot of time discussing this, but if you ever listen to Q2 or if you'd like to start listening to Q2, I would encourage you to take this survey because they're going to use it to decide what they play in the future. So if you don't take this survey, you don't get to complain about the music that they don't play on Q2. Okay, so if you're interested in listening to Q2, please take this survey, and we'll have a link in the show notes. I think it's great that they're doing this, that they're asking people what they want to hear. So this is kind of a little bit of the discovery thing that we were just talking about. I don't have a segue for this next one.
Well, what is the next one?
Out of segues. So the next one, we're gonna move over into Drew's area of expertise. So one of the reasons we invited Drew on today is because we've been talking a little bit about the situation with the Louisville Orchestra and a little bit about the Philadelphia Orchestra, and sometimes we make things up and sometimes we get things really wrong, and that's why we bring Drew on to tell us. So, if you've missed any of our shows or have not been following the situation very closely, Drew, can you just give a brief recap of, I guess we'll start with the Louisville Symphony situation, or the Louisville Orchestra situation?
Sure. The Louisville situation, like a lot of orchestras, started off with financial difficulties. The orchestra wanted to approach the bankruptcy court with a reorganization plan that would excuse them from requirements that are in the what was at that time the existing collective bargaining agreement. And the judge at that point in time said, no, you have to honor the collective bargaining agreement. So the organization made it through the end of the season. They did raise the money they needed to make good on all of the musician payments and other vendors that had to be paid. But their situation overall continued in the direction that it was moving. And the executive committee at the time was still pushing for the basic reorganization plan that they presented back in January. The contract expired in May, and since then the situation has degraded to a point to where it's almost entered into what might be best defined as Lawyerville. Where both sides are trying to maneuver each other into defendable positions in National Labor Relations Board review or in the bankruptcy court to help push what they think should be the strategic agenda for the organization.
So the court decided that the things that they're doing are okay, right? So in Chapter 11, the court has to okay these business decisions, correct?
Correct. The organization, in this case the Louisville Orchestra, has to present a reorganization plan, a new business plan for the organization that demonstrates how long and how they plan to get out of bankruptcy. And the judge either approves it or sends it back and has them modify the plan, or in some cases, like back in January, can simply reject the plan altogether and say you've got to come up with something entirely different and new. And of course, you have the outside influence from the major creditors, who in this case are going to be the musicians, demanding certain things or claiming that the plans being proposed by the organization do or don't include certain facts that should have been included. To a degree, it's not unlike having a collective bargaining agreement session, negotiation session, play out in court publicly.
So we talked last week about something that came up with them that was big news last week, with the letter that was sent to the musicians, right, saying basically we're going to be a per-service ensemble, and you can either be a part of that, or if you don't want to be a part of that, bye. And is that the kind of thing that would have to be approved by the bankruptcy court?
Well, that's more the Lawyerville aspect. The bankruptcy judge can certainly weigh in on that, but it's almost definitely going to produce a National Labor Relations charge on a part of the musicians, claiming that management's trying to coerce the situation. And the musicians' response to that, by the way, was simply, no, thank you, we're not going to take that up. And they even conducted a live demonstration on the deadline that was proposed in the letter that they had to return, whether or not they agreed to these conditions. An important part of that letter that should be pointed out is that it included a passage that if the musicians did not accept those terms, then that was voluntary forfeiture of their position in the orchestra. And of course, that's where it starts to really cross a lot of lines as to whether or not the organization even has that legal authority to be able to make that kind of agreement while the old collective bargaining agreement had expired, and they are currently in mediated negotiation sessions that are being mediated by someone from the Federal Mediation and Conciliation. The acronym's going right out of my head right now.
That's okay.
But from the federal government assigned a mediator to help come in and get both sides talking again and try to find a solution. So you can see where the two can be interpreted as something that are going to be counterproductive from one to another.
Right. One thing that I think strikes me reading about the Louisville Orchestra and their labor negotiations and their bankruptcy court issues is that the mistrust between the management and labor seems very, very similar to what we were talking about earlier this year in Detroit.
Exactly.
And in some ways, I think, especially with this per service letter from last week, is even worse. The civility is even lower than it was between the Detroit Symphony and its musicians. Would you see
perhaps
that?
What
I mean,
Louisville
there's
proposed,
not a lot of room below what things were in Detroit.
Well, what Louisville proposed was something that really couldn't have been done in an apples-to-apples way, although they certainly could have done that, but it wouldn't have been a defendable position for the financial reasons that are being proposed in Louisville. But it's how it's being interpreted by the other side. I think the cuts and the attitude and the process that was being used in Detroit with their executive committee was being interpreted by the musicians the same way that the musicians in Louisville are interpreting that letter and the other proposed changes in the organization. So it certainly is going to degrade that trust to a point to where you have to look at it from a big picture point of view and say, have we crossed a point of no return where the relationship is so damaged there's no way to repair it without either one side forcing the other to cave or having major changes in personnel on one side or the other.
Right, and that's one thing we didn't really see in Detroit was that there were no change at the administrative level, but there were a lot of musicians leaving.
The musicians are leaving. That was a situation I would probably classify as one side forced the other to capitulate. And when another side folds past what they said their line in the sand was, the final result from that is going to be such a poisoned environment, it's going to only prolong, if not preclude, recovery for the organization from that point forward. That's the point of no return. That's what you want to avoid even in an expected contentious negotiation session, is that things don't get so bad that it crosses that point and then it limits the options that you have moving forward.
It's hard for me to believe that they don't expect, if you send such an incendiary letter as that, it surprises me that they either A, didn't realize that the musicians would completely reject the premise of the letter, and or it would make people want to just pull up stakes and leave. And maybe that was their goal. I don't know. But it's surprising to me that they sent that, because to me that seems completely ridiculous, and I'm not the biggest friend of orchestras on the show, you know, and that seemed crazy to me.
Well, it certainly questions the long-term plan. What was the end goal of sending this letter? But that's where I think it's probably better explained by the Lawyerville situation, where they're maneuvering now from a legal perspective as opposed to a relationship or strategic perspective.
Right.
So do you think, is there a way out of this that gets the orchestra both back to profitability and reaches an agreement with the musicians that both sides find equitable? Is there a solution that includes both of those?
Well, that's the good news. There always is a way to get to that point, but the more you make statements that are difficult to retract or move back from without losing face publicly, then the less likely that's going to proceed. And in any good situation, or I should say in any situation, either party needs to step back and realize that in order to get out of the situation they're in, they have to think of a way for the other side to save face.
Right.
And if you don't include that in the quiet part of negotiations, the backroom part of negotiations that happen, then you're not going to get there. I mean, that's just plain and simple. But there certainly is a way to get out of where they're going. But the other complex part of all of this is, since Louisville filed bankruptcy so quickly in the process, there's still the influence of the court. That's one thing you can't back out of unless they want to retract their filing entirely. And that becomes even more difficult to do because that's such an entrenched position. It's very difficult to do that and then say, no, we shouldn't have filed bankruptcy, and then have somebody still find a way to save face, to have trust in that leadership that made that decision.
So at this point, a CBA, just to be clear, would have to be approved also by the bankruptcy court?
At this point, yes.
Okay. So that's now some agreement that has to be reached between 3 parties, I suppose.
Well, it has to be reached by the 2 primary parties, the musicians and the Louisville Orchestra Association. And then if they come to an agreement on something, it would be highly unusual for the bankruptcy judge to say, no, this isn't going to work. Because the whole point of him recommending that they go to mediation was to find a solution that they can both live with, put the numbers together, put in a business plan, present it to the court, and then the judge will almost always rubber stamp it through.
Right. And I think one of the difficult things for us following this sometimes is that we only get to see part of this, right? There's so much of it that's reported in the media, and there's so much of it that happens in a public forum, like a public court. But there's also a good deal of it, and you mentioned this, that occurs, behind the scenes. There are also closed negotiations and back channel negotiations for the CBA. That are happening all the time, right?
Well, that's usually the way it works. Even in situations where you have a lot of brinkmanship going on, but you haven't reached a point where maybe Detroit was, or where Louisville is, or any sort of work stoppage, is even when the board negotiators and the musician negotiation committee are so angry at each other, the way these things usually get solved is the 2 lawyers representing either side, or the 2 negotiators representing it, just call each other, have a quiet conversation. They know how far either side really is going to go, and they have a no-nonsense, no BS, here it is, let's lay it out, let's come up with a solution before we cross this point of no return. We've both pushed our efforts as far as we can go, hurrah, but now we actually get it solved. And then they come up with some sort of solution. Both sides will kind of grumble about the things they had to cave on, and things move on as normal. That's the typical process. But in the last few years, there have been so many organizations that have crossed past that point of no return and taken brinkmanship past the point of brinkmanship where it's now actually the heart. And that's where things really start to fly apart.
Right.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. When did we start talking about the debt ceiling? I was just amazed talking about people taking positions they can't pull back from and trying to save face. That's like somebody in this. It's like signing the no new tax thing, and then trying to compromise.
I was just thinking to myself, man, I've I gotta pull up this other tab of this other story that it was talking about the same stuff, and I couldn't think of what orchestra it was. Just
It's the United States Orchestra.
Well, that's actually a really good analogy, Sam. One of the things that I do when I talk with boards usually, and even some musician negotiation committees from time to time, is I use politicians as a good example of how to create a relationship, because for all their benefits and their shortcomings, the one thing politicians do when they go into political speak is they don't put themselves in such an undefensible position that they can't get out from. Right. So they leave the room open that's necessary to be able to come up with an agreement so they can paint whatever PR sticker they want on it and make themselves look good to their constituents. As unappealing and distasteful as that might seem, it actually is one of the best ways to be able to create an environment that comes up with a good deal.
Absolutely. It works for a reason, I guess.
You just have to take a lot of showers.
Yeah. Right.
So another orchestra that we talked about a little less recently, but they're still kind of toiling just with a little less press these days, is the Philadelphia Orchestra. So it's been a little while since they've been quite as big news as the Louisville Orchestra. So, Drew, do you know what the situation is there right now?
It really hasn't changed very much, other than the fact that there have been more details that have leaked out from their bankruptcy filing. Their strategic plan came out, which I'm still getting through myself. But that situation is a good example of one that hasn't crossed that point of no return yet, even though they filed that bankruptcy. that's still in its early enough stages where a judge has to make any sort of ruling, where he could still even just reject the filing entirely and say, no, everything you presented doesn't meet the level necessary to grant you any of the requests that you've submitted, so you're going to have to continue working with things as they are. And since the organization itself isn't crying the same sort of chicken little sky is falling, we're going to go broke tomorrow because we're out of cash story that you usually hear from groups like Detroit and Louisville, even though that might seem more confusing, it certainly lets the group just continue.
Well, I think the problem with that story in a situation like this is that it simply would be clearly untrue. They still have not a lot of money. Well, it's hard to say that millions of dollars is not a lot of money, but they've got
that's the question.
Some money in their endowment, right?
Well, and that's actually the really big unanswered question in this situation, is they have the money in the endowment. The orchestra claims that everything that's left is restricted funds, meaning that the donor has placed specific use only for this money. And outsiders, the musicians and the national AFM, American Federation of Musicians in particular, have claimed that no, this isn't the case. And since they're one of the largest creditors with the pension plan the musicians are in right now, they want to go in and verify whether or not that's the case. As a matter of fact, that's one of the outstanding larger issues right now, is the musicians filed a request with the court that they be granted a substantial amount of access to institutional records to determine whether or not the endowment is in fact restricted or not. And the organization said, well, no, we really can't bother with that right now because it would take too much of our time.
That's a really tricky situation. It's hard to know what to think when there's so much of that endowment situation that you can't know about.
Right.
Well, especially if a particular gift was given by a foundation or an individual, and it was given long enough ago that there is no longer a representative on behalf of that individual or foundation to determine unequivocally whether or not, yes or no, the orchestra's interpretation or a court's interpretation or the musician's interpretation is accurate for what the original donor's intentions were.
Right. And you would like to think that any donor would see a troubling financial situation and say, well, now that you've got my money, use it for whatever you need to use it for to get out of whatever problem you're in.
And that's exactly it. Sam made the association earlier about parallels with the government. This is the exact same argument that goes on a constitutional basis. Was this the founding fathers' intent? Should it have been done this way? And it all comes down to subjective perspective in the end. And without someone who actually or to make changes to it, then there's no way to really determine whether or not an interpretation is even accurate. And it just further confuses and clouds the issue. But even though there's nothing at the point of boiling over in Philadelphia with that, that's ultimately the organization or the association's point of view, is that if they don't get released from their pension obligations and some of the other obligations that they've filed, their agreement with the Kimmel Center, the Philadelphia Pops, Peter Nero, that the organization will not be able to sustain that expenditure level on the basis they have before, and they will enter the level of financial crisis that you saw in the situation in Detroit.
Yeah.
So we had Drew on to talk about the problems with orchestras. This wasn't on the list, but I think to lighten the mood, we should talk about the Toronto Symphony.
Yeah, I feel bad. We always have Drew on when we're talking about stuff that's going terribly wrong.
You got to solve the problems to get someplace good.
We use the words untenable and intractable a lot when Drew's on.
And bankruptcy.
And bankruptcy, yes.
Toronto's a great situation, Their sound check program, which has been focusing on the 35 and under crowd, and they've been putting a lot of effort into this program for at least, if not close to, at least a decade.
Yeah,
I started following their sound check program back in, I think, 2003, 2004. And they had a very active program that at that time was pre-Facebook, remember?
Yeah.
And they had a very active discussion board where they had regular staff members that were interacting with the under 35 crowd patrons, which really had a good range from the teenage crowd through the 20 to early 30-somethings. And that's been a process to build over the years, which is important to note. But they're starting to reap the rewards from all of that by putting a consistent long-term effort into that process.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's as late as 2001, according to this article, they were suffering from near bankruptcy, is the way it's described.
Okay.
So since then, they seem to, and it's funny, how do you get to 18 to 35 crowd? You offer them special ticket prices. That's a shocker. To me, it's like all the stuff that we say would work is like what the Toronto Symphony is doing, engaging the public, using new media, offering shorter concerts. The whole tailgating thing to me sounds interesting.
I've always wanted to tailgate at a classical concert.
Well, imagine
like
this.
Bring my little barbecue, like the way people tailgate football. Like bring a little barbecue grill and actually tailgate and have beer in the parking lot.
Well, imagine you're 26 years old and you've got a date and you want to do something cool and sort of, off the beaten path. Tailgating for a symphony concert sounds like a really cool idea to me, if they make it cool. So, instituting all these plans is only going to work if the person that's sort of running it knows how to make it cool.
Right.
Well,
and apparently they do.
And the other really key point here that I think needs to be pointed out is the longevity of this program is only going to result from having a person that's vested into it from the organization there for that stretch of time. I don't know if you guys have ever talked about it before, but one of the key problems on the administrative side of the orchestra field is turnover.
You've talked about it on the show.
Well, there we go.
There you go. and I've heard that you're an expert.
So bad. Well, turnover is so bad in these cases that even if you have someone who does everything right, they're not there long enough to see it through to maturity, to where it starts producing the kind of results like you're seeing in Toronto. And there are all sorts of reasons why that needs to change on the administrative side. And orchestra administrations need to be better places to work. They don't focus enough now on creating a worthwhile work environment. They don't do workplace satisfaction surveys. Of course, pay is an issue, but that's all around. You can still create a work environment that's going to be productive, uplifting, and someplace that people want to become vested and stay for a long period of time, as opposed to the pressure-filled, low-return environments that exist right now. So that's the first step in being able to put a program like this in place, because the wider picture with Toronto is this is not the first group that's attempted to do something like this. There have been other groups that have even taken the same name, Soundcheck, and put their own programs into place, but they haven't had the sort of longevity that Toronto has had, and they haven't made the conscious decision to allocate those resources toward the program to be able to see the kind of results that come in. Everyone wants the silver bullet solution to get something that will increase everything now.
Right.
But
if only there was some kind of website that would advertise orchestra business jobs to help the orchestras find best available talent.
Yes.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. There is one at Administration Jobs, where anyone can post a job at an orchestra administration position free of charge, plus people can browse free of charge and apply for the position right online.
Nice.
Well, that's great.
Talking about the silver bullet, the Soundcheck thing has been successful in Toronto, but not because it was a silver bullet. When they started it in 2001, they sold 5,700 tickets, which I don't think any orchestra administrator for less than 6,000 tickets in a whole year for this thing is going to jump up and down with joy. And then last year it was 23,000 tickets, which is starting to talk about real money there, at $14 a ticket. So.
Right. Well, and you'll also getting what you need in the place that people are complaining about now that had eroded away, which is you now have a larger core support base that will start to give to the annual endowment when they get older and start making some money. They'll remain connected with the organization. They'll start bringing friends to buy tickets. I don't know how well they've actually tracked that over the years, is the dynamic ticket sale impact of those individuals that have been brought through a full decade in the program. But yeah, those are all the good things that you're trying to build. And it is a very straightforward, simple idea that you're building your market. You're staying engaged with the customer in a way that's beyond just simply selling them something, but keeping them involved with the organization and giving someone inside the institution the freedom and the support to be able to continue to do that, so that you get the kind of results they're seeing.
We should find out who runs the sound check program in Toronto. Get them on the show.
On the show. One thing
you should. I forget her name. She's a really sharp administrator. But yeah, it'd be great to be able to talk to her and see how she's worked with the program over the years and the sort of changes that they've had in place.
Right.
One thing we observed when we talked about this a couple of weeks ago was that a lot of the parts of this sound check initiative, the concert, after the concert, the party, the barbecue, whatever, a lot of it is not directly related to the music itself in any way. Do you think, is there any reluctance among the rest of the orchestra world to use these things? Do they maybe see it as like a gimmick or a distraction even from the concert itself? Or do you think they're just trying to bring people in, they don't care why?
Well, there's a couple of reasons why. It's no one single thing. You do get a philosophical divergence in opinion as to whether or not that's really worthwhile putting the time into or not. But that's ultimately superseded by some of the items that are beyond organization's control. One of the main things you're talking about, like with tailgating, is you would have to have the parking facilities to be able to facilitate that. If you don't, it's all for naught. But the actual physical concert environment makes a substantial difference into whether or not you can even use facilities. The orchestra doesn't own and operate the hall. That's an additional rental they have to put into it. You have to have the staff that stay afterward to be able to facilitate all of this and keep it going. It's a larger, very important discussion that I don't think gets necessarily the amount of attention it does in the field right now, but it is the larger concert environment perspective. Here in Chicago, the Grant Park Music Festival is a great example of the fact that it's not hard to sell classical music. They have an average attendance in the numbers, I think, like 8,000 to 10,000 per concert.
Wow.
Per concert. And they don't do schlock. They do really heavy-duty, serious, normal programming works. So all of those programming discussions are on the periphery. They just play good music, and they play it well, and they try to get better each season. So that's just coupled with the fact that it's a really cool environment. You have these fantastic lawn seats. The sound system is really good. It's a place where people can go to have fun. They can bring their picnic. It's certainly different than the normal concert environment, and there are things that you can't compare between those two. But it's a good example of how putting the time and effort into designing a concert experience in the physical surroundings is going to be able to impact the final results.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing I took from reading the article about Toronto is it's like, oh, they're not operating with any sense of entitlement. They're assuming they're going to have to work to get their audience and work hard, and it seems to be working.
Although I do have to interject, you guys wanted to talk about something positive right now, but a couple of weeks ago you were giving another writer online grief about the article that wanting to focus on the positive things inside business.
Yeah, well.
We ignore our own hypocrisies.
That's right.
We just point out other people's.
Right.
Mireille has called me the shock jock of new music, so I'm just trying to live up to that moniker.
You're doing it well, Sam.
You're going to put that on your resume now, right?
I am professional shock jock.
Yeah.
And on to the pick of the week.
Yes.
No. Yes.
Yes, I think we should.
Yes.
As fascinating as the discussion with Drew is, we're running short on time, so we'll probably have to do this a little quicker than the normal pick of the week. But our pick this week is a recent release by the International Contemporary Ensemble. We had Du Yun on a couple of weeks ago, who is part of the ICE collaboration group, and she's worked with ICE Lab, and so this is not from ICE Lab, obviously, but this is a recent release of theirs. John Adams' Son of a Chamber Symphony. There's also a string quartet on this album. But The piece itself was written in 2007, and it's something of a spiritual sequel to a piece he wrote in the 90s. I want to say 92, his Chamber Symphony. So let's listen to a little bit of the first movement of John Adams' Son of a Chamber Symphony. So if you've listened to any Adams, that probably sounds like a lot of other Adams that you've listened to in your life.
Right. My conclusion was if you like John Adams, with finger quotes, you're going to like this because it sounds a lot like the John Adams you know.
What do you guys think of the medium or the form maybe of chamber symphony? Seems kind of like the name just seems contradictory, don't you think?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, he didn't invent it. Obviously, Schoenberg is the chamber symphony guy, and in a lot of ways, Adams says that this piece and the original chamber symphony of his are kind of a reference to the Schoenberg chamber symphony. What were you going to say, Sam?
Well, to me, it just seems more to have to do with how you're using your resources. You know, you can have 100 people on stage, but it can still sound a lot like chamber music depending on how you harness those 100 people. You know what I mean? Yeah. And then, in the same token, like a big list piano piece can sound very orchestral because it's all 10 fingers slamming down a lot. So, to me, that's what it's getting at. You know, like that piece sounded small, like chamber music.
Well, and that's something he says in the liner notes to the album. He says, let me see. The combined sound of dozens or more skilled soloists can afford a musical experience that combines the intimacy of chamber music with the breadth and scale of a full orchestra. And I think he really gets that through this kind of rhythmic complexity that you heard building there at the beginning. That kind of he can build something that mimics the scale of the orchestra, but then he's also dealing with a group of soloists. So you hear in several parts individual very lyrical solo lines, a lot like the Schoenberg Chamber Symphony, these very lyrical romantic sounds as well. Looks like we lost Nate.
No, he's just concentrating on what we're saying very, very hard. It's just interesting to me. I remember studying as an undergraduate, Dr. O'Brien showing us examples of like tutti and concertino and symphonic versus chamber style. And something doesn't have to be 110 players on stage to be symphonic style, and it doesn't have to be, a very limited number of people to be chamber style. And to me, this is just an illustration of that idea. It works both directions.
One thing. Oh, go ahead, Drew.
Well, I was going to say, firstly, what I liked about it was not unlike some of the things I enjoy when I'm listening to Hovhannes, which is you have the large number of players on stage, which simply gives the composer more of a canvas to paint with. They can still do something that's going to be very chamber-oriented all the way through, but instead of listening to a septet or something with just the 6 different instruments, you now have this much larger variety to be able to build, I think, what's more of a symphonic picture, which is a larger, more drawn out experience that can take you in more places, but it still never has to have all 100 plus musicians playing toward that one pinnacle moment in the piece. Right. I always find that just fantastic. It also opens up from a venue experience a lot of different opportunities, because there are a lot of really good under 1,000 seat halls that have large stages and can accommodate that many musicians.
Right.
So you can actually get something really useful out of these sorts of works that may get drowned up a bit in a big barn hall.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. schools of music, for example, will often have that kind of a concert
Chamber
setup.
hall, yeah.
You know, big enough stage, but, you know, 500, 1,500 or so at the most seating. That's a great piece for that.
And this kind of large chamber number of musicians is really interesting too, because it gives you the opportunity to have those great solo moments, but it's big enough that you can still have sections within it, the same way you would have big sections in an orchestra. So it's big enough that there are subsets of the full group that can still be powerful and still be an entity of their own. You know, when you think about a string quartet, there aren't enough players to have a section that you identify really as a distinct section, where there is in something like this, which is really cool. Another thing I like about it is the self-referential content. You know, he's John Adams is a guy that's had this amazing career, and he's referencing you know, his own chamber symphony from a decade and a half earlier, and he's also referencing Schoenberg. He also in the third movement references Nixon in China. You'll hear something in the third movement that sounds scarily reminiscent of News from Nixon in China. I'll play just a tiny little clip of that, and if you know Nixon in China, you'll instantly recognize this. This is not Nixon in China. This is the Son of a Chamber Symphony. So I think especially when the piano and the high woodwinds join in, you hear that Nixon in China really clearly. And I think it's cool that he's taking some of that stuff and continuing this interaction between his own oeuvre. You know, it's a cool thing to do for somebody that's got an oeuvre to work with.
Do either of you guys know if Adams wrote this for a specific ensemble?
I don't actually. He did. I know he was. I mean, it was a commission, and so I'm sure there was a specific premiere in mind. He does mention in his blog that there was. He knew when he was writing the piece that there was going to be a ballet made of it. Though he did not consider any of the dance when he was writing the work.
Well, something that's always fascinated me with composition over the centuries even is much earlier in time, when a composer had a very limited group of musicians that were available to him at the time, he wrote for the strengths and around the weaknesses of those individual musicians. And the comment you made earlier, Sam, kind of struck my memory about the soloistic nature of a lot of the writing. Is if you're writing for a very specific ensemble, then if you have an intimate enough relationship with that ensemble and the musicians in it, you can start to do more of that writing. And I've always wondered if, from an artistic point of view, how detached composers are from most major, large performing organizations, that they can even build a strong enough relationship to be able to take that approach and take advantage of or work around particular weaknesses in an ensemble to be able to produce a final product.
These days, I would guess that most composers that are even cranking out symphonic works don't have that kind of relationship with an orchestra.
But chamber works.
Yeah. If they've got a good, close working... I mean, to me, it's interesting that you bring that up, because it's impossible to imagine that Mozart and, you know, the people who... even though it doesn't really fit in my mind, sort of the tradition of this profession is based on what we think about what they did. I'm sure Mozart knew everything there was about the ensembles that he played for, and he played keyboard in the ensemble and on his operas and all these kinds of things. But I think most composers, if they're writing for a big ensemble like a symphony, are just assuming that they're all super good players, you know, who came out of one of the virtuoso factories in the United States, and they can write whatever they want, and it's going to be fine.
Well, I think, though, it's interesting that this recording is by the International Contemporary Ensemble. This is something that ICE has taken on as a project of their own, this is interaction and collaboration between composers and performers, and it's actually something we're going to talk about on this coming Music is Hard on Wednesday, 2 p.m. Eastern. You should check it out live. There will be links. But that's something that the International Contemporary Ensemble does, is they have kind of this community of performers and composers, and the composers write specifically for those people. Now, that's not to say that writing for a specific person doesn't then yield a piece that can be played by a lot of other people, but it's something that I think is quite common in chamber music today for composers.
Right. It's just a shame it doesn't extrapolate itself into the larger symphonic model. I think there's a lot of business reasons that I think are counterproductive, frankly, to why that doesn't happen, and why there should be composers that would be part of a typical collective bargaining agreement in most organizations, so they can develop that collegial kind of relationship with the actual instrumentalists in the group, and produce works that we're not seeing now, but more importantly, make it something that is a unique product of that institution, its community. If everyone's talking about being more relevant to your communities, that's one of the best ways I think you can go around doing that, is starting to really build this cohesiveness, as opposed to what Sam mentioned, which I think is one of the problems today, is you assume they can all play because they came from the virtuoso factories and they can all that's great, but it denies the individuality that supposedly is what built at least the American symphonic tradition into the Philadelphia sound, the Chicago sound, the Omaha sound, whatever you want it to be. And we've lost that, so that kind of loses the overall value of what an arts institution is.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we're losing with the loss of composer in residence positions in orchestras. If you talk to people today that have the luxury, the great honor of being a composer in residence at an orchestra, a lot of them will tell you that they indeed do what you're saying. They think of writing for the individuals in the ensemble. But right. You know, when you're just writing generically, I sit down to write an orchestra piece and hope and pray that someday somebody will think it's good enough to rehearse in an orchestra sometime. You don't get to do that. So right. It's a tiny minority of people that actually do have the luxury of considering, individual players.
Yeah, and those are all large budget orchestras typically too.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, so there are some big stereotypes that everybody sort of knows that, if I were writing for my hometown symphony, the Chattanooga Symphony, I would know some tricks about them because I've seen them perform so many times. But in general, people rely, if I got to write a piece for the Chicago Symphony, I wouldn't hold back on the low brass, because they've got this reputation of, I'd probably
playing loud.
I'd put some sort of big bombastic bass trombone something in there just because I know it's going to get, ripped up. It's going to get ripped up. So, but as far as a more nuanced vision, you're right. It's really lacking, especially because of composer in residence programs being gone.
Yeah.
Well, and I still purport that composer in residence programs are a watered down version of what should exist.
Yeah.
In organizations, there really isn't any other way of getting around the fact that they need to be in the collective bargaining agreement like the rest of the instrumentalists and a larger part of the ensemble. And it needs to be something that's a goal. And if it's not a goal, it surprises me, even from instrumentalists, how much resistance there is to the idea. I guess it's kind of a larger subject, and I don't want to hijack the discussion at all, but I've never also understood why composers allow themselves to be treated that way.
Right. Well, because we've been trained that to get an orchestra piece even sniffed at, we should consider ourselves lucky,
Right.
And it's because the culture of war horses that's out there. But, you know, everything we talk about, always a related issue is we talk about programming and how to make orchestras more profitable and catering to younger audiences. And at least at the periphery of all those discussions is continuing to do nothing but war horses isn't going to get the job done anymore. So I think that plays perfectly into what you're talking about. If you get composers, new composers putting out new music that, you know, will appeal to a younger crowd, maybe we'd be on the right direction.
Well, I don't disagree with that at all. And it's a great example of now the larger discussion of the frustration that some people express with stereotypical points of view of why are there unions, why are there not unions. One of the things that at least collective representation has been able to do in a very positive sense with inside the business is it does act as a meaningful force to be able to take a discussion outside of the spreadsheet environment. For example, if composers actually thrust themselves upon the existing collective bargaining environment that is and demanded from the American Federation of Musicians better representation and to be looked at as something that should be included in the collective bargaining agreement, then you're going to have that organization which has the necessary influence to make that happen. Mm-hmm. As opposed Absolutely. To having to come up with the answers to explain why from the spreadsheet point of view that should be, which I think is what the composer in residence model is right now.
Right.
So it's interesting, just in a larger, just looking at kind of a bigger discussion point of view as to where composers can go with that. And I've never had enough discussions with composers to know what the answer is. But if you allow yourself to be treated like a dog, don't be surprised when you're treated like a dog.
Right.
Right.
Well, you know, we're running out of time, and I would love to continue this discussion. We should have you on again sometime, Drew, to
Power
talk
to the
about
composer episode.
The business relationships between composers and orchestras. I think it'd be a great discussion.
I do too.
So we'll have to get that on the schedule sometime soon. But I think we're going to have to call this one a week. Next week's Pick of the Week is going to be Missy Mazzoli's 1,000 Tongues, and she'll be on the show to discuss that with us. So you should definitely check us out again next week because we're going to have a really one of the really interesting up and coming composers. It's hard to even call her up and coming. Still, she's there. So you should definitely check that out. I don't think that recording has been released yet, so you may have some trouble getting to it. We'll have to check with her about making it available on our site, though I kind of doubt that's going to be cool. So that's going to be next week. Please tune in if you have any comments on any of the things that we've talked about on the show, or if you'd like to correct anything that we've said on the show, which is likely. You can head over to our website, soundnotion.tv/SN is the URL for this show, and you can leave us a note there, or you can correct us on Facebook and Twitter, or if you have any ideas for anything you'd like us to discuss that we haven't discussed yet, you can make those suggestions there. If you like the show, we'd love for you to share it with friends or donate using the links on our site. SoundNotion's introduction includes music by Patrick Gulo, who will be finally back again with us next week, and video in our introduction is by Tyler Lepp. Thanks again for watching and listening. We'll see you again next week.